Hello, Redeemer. My name is Brian Holt. I'm one of your pastors here. And as we're continuing on in this series of First Timothy, we get to this passage that talks about the care of widows. And it's actually one of the longest sort of movements in this book of First Timothy. And one of the things we thought we would do is sit down and have a conversation about caring for widows in the church. And so I've invited my mom, Debbie Holt, to join us here today. So, it's kind of a weird question, but other than Debbie Holt and my mom, who are you? What do you do? What do you enjoy? Just give us a bit of an introduction.
Well, sure. Apart from being your mom, which is a great pleasure, I will have to say.
Has it always been?
It really has. There were a few bumps in the road,
Sure.
but basically, you've been a great kid. I tell people you were one of those kids that I could drop you on your head and you'd bounce. Oh. And so you've been very resilient over the years.
And how many times did you test that theory?
Well,
I'm interrupting.
Yes,
please keep going.
I will keep going. Okay, but apart from being a Nana and a mom, mm-hmm. I also hold a clinical counseling license in the state of Ohio. I started out as a nurse in my younger years, mm-hmm. but then when your dad got into pastoring a church and we saw that there were so many emotional marriage needs, those mm-hmm. kind of things, yeah. I decided to go back and get my master's in counseling. And so I actually formed a Christian counseling private practice that I did and enjoyed for 16 years. Yeah. But after your dad died, I knew I had to pick up some health insurance and some benefits. Yeah. And so I applied at a large nonprofit hospice in Ohio called Ohio's Hospice of Dayton. Mm-hmm. And I ended up working part-time as a bereavement counselor there for about 6 months, and I loved it so much. Yeah. And I felt like it was just the place for me. Yeah. That I retired from my private practice. I closed my practice, and I went full-time. And that's what I did for the next 15 years. We offer bereavement counseling to people who have had losses in the hospice, but also losses in the community. So we deal with a lot of very tragic, traumatic losses. Yeah. And in the last year, I've transitioned into a different job where I'm actually the program coordinator for all of Ohio's Hospice of Dayton bereavement programs in Southwest Care Region, which is a large region in Southwest Ohio. Yeah. So I do a lot of teaching, I do a lot of mentoring, I do a lot of program management, process improvement, all those things. And I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, and it's been cool for me to see how God used both your professional experience and then your life experience to create this essentially ministry opportunity where you're caring for people in the circumstances and we've had that conversation multiple times. Just the way God moves in that way was kind of fun to see, and it was cool to see fruitfulness come out of that, even something so challenging. So I want to get to the story a little bit, share with some people how Dad passed away, what that was like, even get into the first year. So we're coming up on 17 years ago. Mm-hmm. So I was 22, and Dad passed away right before his 51st birthday, right? So why don't you just kind of share with us the high points of that story, how all that happened, what that was like in the initial crisis?
Sure. Well, to set the background, I would say that we were probably in one of the best times of our lives. Your dad was teaching at Cedarville University, and he loved it. He was teaching in the Bible department. He had pivoted from being a pastor of a church to teaching at the university, and that was really his place. Yeah. His students were really his congregation, and he loved it. He thoroughly enjoyed it. Yeah. He was getting his D-Min in homiletics from Gordon Conwell Seminary, and he loved being that professional challenge. Yeah. I was doing well in my private practice. I had just turned 50, and you were pretty much launched, which was great.
Yeah, towards the end of college.
Yes, towards the end of college, getting ready to get married to Anna, we love Anna, and it was a great time of our life. So we just saw nothing but great road ahead of us. We had things settled. I think things were very settled. But we went out to visit your grandparents, his parents, on the 4th of July weekend of 2005. And your dad was a runner, somewhat of a weekend runner, but still weekend warrior, but he
Yep.
still was a runner. He was a vegetarian, and we thought he was very healthy.
Yep.
And he went out for a run on the morning of the 4th of July, and I came out and found him dead in the front yard.
Yeah.
And we later learned that he had a massive heart attack, had taken him very quickly without much warning.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was waiting for the squad to come, I remember leaning over his body and thinking, and maybe even said out loud, my life will never be the same. I knew from that moment that nothing would be the same, and it hasn't been.
Yeah.
My life is not the same. I am not the same person.
Gosh, yeah.
But I've got lots to say about how God redeems our pain.
That's exactly
Lots
right.
of that.
That's exactly
But you ask about what the first year was, and
Yeah.
I mean, it was horrible. You were working at Best Buy in
In the Geek Squad.
Yeah, in the Geek Squad in Dayton.
Yeah.
So how was I going to tell you this?
Yeah.
It was horrible.
Because I was I was at work that
Yes.
morning, working on the 4th of July, and you were out in Iowa, so we
Right.
were states apart. You were traveling.
Right.
Yeah.
So I knew I couldn't call you.
Yep.
That wasn't what I needed to do. So I enlisted some good friends,
Yep.
and I asked them to please go and tell you.
Yep.
What I didn't realize is they were going to put you on the phone so I could tell you, which was okay.
Yeah.
But I wanted somebody to be there with you.
Yep.
And I remember the only thing that I was thinking is I needed you.
Yeah.
I needed you to get to Iowa. I didn't care how it happened.
Yeah.
I needed you to get there pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And how did that happen? You can talk about how that happened.
So the two elders came in and they said that you have to call your mom. And, you know, two people that you haven't seen in a few years come in and tell you to call your mom who's traveling. You're like, all right. So I'm frantic. And I literally go back into this little bay, the little cave, and I'm dialing a phone number. And I'm like, this hasn't been your phone number in 10 years. Like, it's just funny the way that the crisis scrambles your ability to think clearly. So stop. Okay,
Yeah.
what is your phone number? All
Yeah.
right, let me put that in. And I call you, and I remember, you just said very plainly, Brian, Dad's dead. Shared with me a bit of the story. I remember weeping in Best Buy, and then coming out and sitting in my truck and crying for a much longer time. I called Anna, called Anna's parents, went back, called my roommate, some of my best friends. Went back to the house, or the apartment where my friend and I were living. He had left his work and sat with me on the couch. We got plane tickets to leave that night, but the fastest way we had to drive, from to Cincinnati and then back, and it was a nightmare. Anna drove in. It was wild. So I flew out that night. So 4th of July night, I take off from Cincinnati and fly to Iowa by myself, and I remember it was just the weirdest emotions of seeing fireworks, from below or from above, as I'm essentially flying to mourn. So I got there late that night, and Anna arrived early the next morning, and then we packed everything up and drove back to Ohio. And that was an 11-hour drive, something like that. Yeah.
And I just laid in the back seat and cried or nothing, zoned out,
Yeah.
slept maybe a little bit.
One of the most poignant memories I have is when we arrived at the house. One of our family friends was mowing the front lawn, which was just a sweet, I don't even know what to do. I'm going to go mow the lawn. And I remember you walking. I was standing in the front driveway, talking to Jim, who had been mowing the lawn, and I could hear you crying, weeping inside the house.
Yeah, I told you not to come inside the house.
Yep.
I had to go in first. I had to go into the bedroom, and it was horrible.
It was
I mean,
very difficult. Yeah.
I
And I
mean,
was an only child that didn't come up, so there's not that much.
Right.
There weren't
Right.
others around to
Right.
help that. So.
right.
So this happened July 4th. We had already planned, Anna and I were going to get married New Year's Eve that same year. So we're now 6 months away from wedding planning, all those things. So as you said, your life was never going to be the same. Talk to me and share with me a little bit of what was going on behind the scenes that maybe I didn't see or and maybe I saw some of it, but in that first year, what was that
Yeah.
like?
Yeah, it was horrible. There's no other way to put it. I used to
Yeah.
have a client who would come in, and he was an older man, and all he would say is, "It's just horrible. It's
Yeah.
just horrible." That's all he could say. It was extremely difficult. I could talk, and let me just pivot and say that I had an extraordinary amount of support. And when we talk later about what the church can do and how they can be helpful, I'll really focus in on
Yeah.
the ways that because there are different kind of comforters.
That's right.
And you pointed out already that one of the different kind of comforters was the one who said, "I knew you were going to have a lot of people coming in. I knew
Yeah.
you had been out of town, and I just wanted your lawn to look nice." That was a comforter.
Yeah.
So there's something for everyone to do. But I had a lot of support. There's no question. But, I had a couple of pictures that God gave me very early on. And one of them was of giving birth. And the idea of when you give birth, hopefully you have something that you're waiting for that's going to be beautiful and a reward.
Yeah.
And hopefully you've got supporters. You've got your husband, you've got the nurses, you've got whoever you've got with you.
Right.
But at the end of the day, a woman gives birth herself.
Right.
She's the only one that experiences the pain and has the full experience. And I felt that was a good picture of my grief, because I had a lot of people who would help me, a lot of people. But in the end of the day, it was my pain that I had to work through. And the depth of the pain was incredible. The pain was very physical. I would say for the first several months, I couldn't eat. I ate a little bit, but nothing sounded good. My stomach was upset most of the time. I couldn't sleep.
Yeah.
I would wake up in the middle of the night thinking about finding him and all the horror. I would re-experience that. I had an incredible amount of stress because it was so sudden. Nothing was planned. We had
Right.
never talked about anything. I mean,
Right.
you don't when you're 50 and you're healthy, and
Yeah.
we still had all of our friends were alive, all of our parents were alive. I mean, we had not imagined this, so nothing was in place. Nothing.
Right.
And so there were a lot of decisions to be made. I had horrible anxiety about money.
Yeah.
Pastors don't make a lot of money, relatively. University Bible professors don't usually make a lot of money.
Yeah.
And in my profession, when I worked, I got paid by
Yeah.
insurance companies and that. But if
Yep.
I didn't work, I didn't get paid.
Right.
So I did not have a salary. So it's a lot of anxiety about money. Am I going to, have? I was running my own business. The ability to make decisions was very compromised, even though I had always been a very decisive, confident person. I had trouble making decisions. I had to ask people. When I think about how many people could have derailed my life with poor wisdom, it's just the grace of God. These people were wonderful.
Yeah.
And I have to say that I would say that in the 16 years since almost 17 years since your dad died,
Yeah.
I have not made a bad decision. I haven't.
I've made lots.
And I mean,
No, but I understand. When you're talking about the big
I made
movements
some
and the
major decisions.
Yeah.
I had, as you know, 8 months in, I had to move my practice because my partner had an affair.
Yeah.
And I could not, as a Christian, stay associated with somebody who had a moral failing like that.
Yep.
And so I took a different job. There were many things that were just
Yeah. And you think about the fact that you owned a home,
right.
And your college son no longer lived there.
Right.
Your husband had passed, and so now you're trying to upkeep a home by yourself. And there's lots of things. And I would say, I was a foolish 22-year-old, so there's a ton that I didn't know. And looking back, I'm like, man, I realize how much I didn't know. But even in that, I could see and I wouldn't say that you ever burdened me unnecessarily with your anxiety or things like that, but I could see your concerns shifted. That when you and Dad were together and things were thriving, there were, things, hey, this is what we're working towards, this is what, we're concerned about. The conversations shifted more towards that security. What am I going to do? How am I going to be able to retire? And I didn't see outright fear, but it was like, this is now a bigger concern than it had ever been.
Huge.
Just
hugely.
Yeah.
And the thing is that I'd always been a pretty self-confident person. I mean, I started a business. I ran it.
Yeah.
But there was an emotional component to that. When your partner, who you had always talked through things with, you really ended up feeling like you were standing alone because it was all ultimately your responsibility. Yeah. And part of the suddenness of things really brought about the anxiety. And one of the things we know about grief is that, and most people don't recognize, is the primary emotional component of grief is not sadness, but it's anxiety. Because all of a sudden, even if you were expecting a death, all of a sudden it's happened, and it always feels sudden. Yeah. And so, I came to the point where I was rubbing a place on my top of my head raw. I was rocking in bed at night. Yeah. I mean, I couldn't sleep. This from a person who had never struggled with anxiety. Right. So, and I felt guilty, and this is very appropriate for grievers right now. I felt guilty because I felt like, was I letting the Lord down by struggling so much? It was such a struggle. And even though my faith was incredibly strong, and I want to talk about that next, I felt like I was letting him down somehow by having so much trouble with this. I would have to say that I didn't struggle with anger. And there's a reason for that, and I'm going to talk about that. I say next, but I've got it in my mind.
There's a lot of things that are next. I love this.
But the flow, I really want to keep with the flow. I didn't struggle with anger. I had prayed very, very early that I would not harden my heart towards God, even though this was not to be understood. I couldn't understand it. Yeah. And I learned early that it was really okay to have what might be viewed as an anger with open hands rather than a closed fist, which was like the cries of Psalms, where you say, why? Yeah. I don't get it. Yeah. Here he had this great ministry, this great future. Yeah. He was a great dad. He was a great husband. Not perfect dad, not perfect husband, but good enough, darn good enough. Yeah. I knew we were going to have grandkids. This whole picture, I said, why? Yeah. I don't get it. And that was kind of the anger part. And at the bottom of it, I really think that I just felt very lost. And the interesting thing about that was that it was an emotional loss, but I knew I was never lost. Yeah. And that's where I want to just talk about the great height of joy. And I don't know if you know this story.
Oh, gosh.
No, that's a good one.
A good story. I like good stories.
It's a good story. We'll come to other things later.
I'm sure.
But the great thing, and this is so applicable to people right now, just even who aren't grieving, who are going through the daily stuff of life, is that I really believe that about a year earlier, God had prepared me specifically for this. There was a point where your dad was kind of in a career fork in the road. And one fork would lead to something that I would think would cause him to be just very, very content and happy and productive, and it would be a great choice for both of us. The other branch, maybe not so much, and I was concerned about some fallout from that, some ramifications from how he would handle, how I would handle. Sure. And so I really struggled through that because the decision was not in our hands, it was in someone else's. Yep. And I really struggled. I struggled with God over that. And I realized that in the midst of that struggle, the greatest question God was asking me is, do you know that I am good? Oof. Do you know that whatever the outcome, I am good? Yeah. And you know what? That got settled. And so I realized that that was no longer, even when I was looking at my husband on the ground, gone from me, that was not a question. That was never a question. God was good. And so, my encouragement to people listening today is that God is going to take you into those decision points. He's going to lead you to those times when you might not even realize that you're making subtle decisions to think the right way about God, to know that God is good, to know that God is omnipotent, that he's all powerful, he's all loving, and don't ignore those. Listen to those, because he's leading you and preparing you for potentially something very big in the future.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you said that for you, the goodness of God was settled prior.
Yes.
For me, it was settled during. So as I think back on the arc of my personal faith, that I wrestled through some things earlier in college and had settled on the empty tomb, and had settled, so now my life needs to align with that resurrection. Then, as Dad passed, it was, okay, so the tomb is empty, but so what? Is God still good? And it was settled there, which then, as this isn't a podcast about grief necessarily, but there were a number of other losses that happened in rather short succession.
Yes.
Grandma passed away that next year. Grandpa passed away a year after that. A couple of years after that, my uncle, your brother.
1 year.
1 year after that, your brother passed away. Shortly after that, your father passed away. Shortly after that, Anna and I had a miscarriage. It was so we became very acquainted with grief, and I'm thankful for the work that God did early on in that.
Yeah.
You talked about faith. So have you said all the things you wanted to say about that? Talk more about that if there's things.
There is one more
please,
thing.
Yes.
There is one more thing that I really learned. I felt very, very vulnerable in the midst of all this. Dad had been a fierce protector. I always knew that about him. Nobody was going to hurt me and get away with it with him. Not that he was vengeful, but he was a protector. And I missed that. All of a sudden, I felt very exposed. I felt very vulnerable. And so one of the most precious things that I learned in the midst of this is what Eugene Peterson, who just recently died, called the standing and the stooping postures of God. And so I needed the standing posture of God. I needed the powerful God that was my refuge, that was my rock, that was my shelter, that was my strong tower. And I lived in the Psalms for the first year. I studied all those words. I listed out all those words of who God was. And so I was able to see the standing. And I always thought about that in the person of God the Father. And in the person of God the Son, Jesus. He was the stooping. He was the comforter. He was the tender Jesus who grieved along with me, who listened to all my pain. And it was abiding. And, theologically, I don't mean that this was just an emotional place that I was at, the way that I saw God in his different facets and his different people relating to me. And, I had a very strong picture, and then I will move on. But I had a very strong vision early, not a weird vision. I mean, come on. But I'm a Presbyterian. But a strong visual of this idea of lost. And, it came from Lake Higgins. Remember Higgins Lake in Michigan? And one of the things that I used to do is I used to love to get in this one-person raft, and I would tie it to the dock, and then I would just kind of float around, you know. But I knew I'd never get very far.
I was like 10. I remember that.
Yeah. And the thing about it is that I realized that in a real boat, in a real dock and all that, that, you could get pretty buffered. It kept knocking against the the dock, and the waves would come and debris would come by. But you know what? I was anchored. I was anchored. I was never going to move farther away from that dock than then that anchor allowed. And that was my picture. That was my confidence. God is I'm going to be battered by anxieties and all the rest of the stuff, but I'm never going to drift.
Yeah, which is straight, I mean, literally, that's straight out of Scripture. One of my favorite passages is in Hebrews, where it talks about Jesus Christ being the sure and steadfast anchor of our soul. And it's just such vivid imagery.
It was, and God blessed me with that early, and it was just something that I held on to. So encompassing that first year, I will just say, I never realized how exhausted I would be. I journaled. It took a year and 3/4 before I stopped saying I'm so tired. And I was sleeping after a while. Yeah. And I never knew how long it would take to begin to feel stable again, to feel like I had my feet underneath me for long periods of time. Yeah. But the pain, as deep as the pain was, the height of the joy of realizing that God is who he says he is. Yeah. All his promises are true. He is with you. Yeah. He was with me. He was in the suffering with me. Not just with me, he was in it.
That's amazing. So as you think back on that first year, and I appreciate you being willing to go the depths of some of your own personal experience. As you think about how people came alongside, maybe in the initial phase, what comes to mind? What stories? What was most helpful as you're sharing from your own experience? Where maybe even where was there a gap that I wish somebody had known? Talk to me more about the people that came alongside in that, in that first year.
I sure will, because they were wonderful.
Yeah.
God equipped me and gave me wonderful people. This is where I could get emotional, okay? So that's why I got the Kleenex over here. I'm ready for that. It's the people.
Yeah.
It's the people who loved me, who God loved me through. Yeah. And they were wonderful. So I knew that when I was in Iowa, I was smart enough to know that it was going to be difficult for me to get through all the funeral, all the stuff that had to happen. Yeah. I was already experiencing some anxiety, so called the doctor, said I need to get something for anxiety on board. Yeah. And so I called Jack and Melanie Kibbleback and said, hey, you got to go to the pharmacy and pick it up, and you got to get to my house as soon as I get there.
The practical stuff.
It was the practical stuff. Yeah. I was always, I never lost my practical planner. I'm a planner.
That's true.
So they came almost right away. Yeah. And I remember what I said to her when I hugged her. I said, don't leave me. Mm-hmm. Because I knew that Dad didn't choose to leave me, but I was still left. Yeah. And so I think that a griever is extremely sensitive to the abandonment of people. Yeah. And I know that sometimes people will not call or reach out because they'll say, I don't know what to say. Yeah. Now, I don't know that was so much true for me, but I know it's true for a lot of people. And you know what? That's interpreted as you don't care.
It is.
Even if you do care, it's interpreted as I don't care. And so
I still say, I remember in the moment of crisis, I referred to one of my good friends coming home from work, and we sat on the couch and did not talk for 6 hours as I waited for the plane. And that was, I'm going to get choked up, one of the most meaningful things because he was just there. Yeah. There's nothing to say. You can't make it better, but you can be with me in that moment, and that's really meaningful.
And I remember those same friends, that same group of friends, long visitation lines, right?
Oh, gosh,
But they kept just going back and getting in line. Yeah. Because they came through 2 or 3 times, just say, hey, how are you? Yep. Some of my best friends, they know my favorite candy is chocolate-covered raisins. And they just had this little bowl, and every once in a while they'd come up and say, you want a few chocolate-covered? I mean, you know, there were people that were really very gifted in sitting next to me and telling me God's truth. And there were people who were wonderful to hug me, people who were wonderful. But, those aren't the only kind of comforters you need. Yep. So one of the things that continues to be the hardest part of widowhood for me is fixing things.
Yep.
I am not I can fix people. I mean, if that's even possible.
I understand what you mean.
But I can sit with suicidal, those things don't bother me. Yeah. but it just overwhelms me when something breaks.
Yeah.
And I don't even know who to call.
Yeah.
So I remember that first, it was probably 6 months and we were into the winter, and
Yeah.
all of a sudden the heat just stopped.
Yeah.
And the first thing I did was cry, which was what I always did.
Yeah.
And then I called Bill Imperial,
Yeah.
and he brought Dave Rue over with him
Yeah.
because I think they thought it was a two-person job, one to handle me and one to handle. But, it was a simple thing. He went down and he said, when was the last time you changed the filter in your furnace?
Yeah.
And my statement was, I didn't even know a furnace had a filter.
Right.
So there were a lot of ways in which, and to this day, you ask me, when we get into that issue about how the church helps me, how a widow, how a family helps a widow and everything. Well, I have no family. I mean, I live 2 hours away from you.
Yep.
And you've fixed many things. What?
Sorry. Literally just went, well, I have no family when you're sitting next to Oh,
No,
man.
yeah, no.
No,
I have
understand.
no
in your daily rhythms
right
of life.
Yes, other than my mom,
we live
who
several
actually
years
she
away-
is
yeah, several
more
hours
she's
away.
more
Yeah.
handy than I am with things.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of things I can call you for, and you'll point me in the right direction. But it's really been my life group that has, and other people in my life who have been those. Oh yeah, you have blinds that need to be put up, or I tried to change the flusher on the toilet, and contrary to popular belief, not everything can be learned from YouTube. I'm sure that they were instructing quite well, but
Yeah.
I wasn't getting it, whatever it was.
Yeah.
So, there were people who were told me that I'm okay.
Yeah.
People who told me I would be okay. People who told me when I'd say, I feel like I'm failing in this grief. No, you're not.
Yeah.
You're grieving. It's okay. It's okay to still not be okay.
Yeah.
I'm a planner, and I wanted to know how it all was going to look. It doesn't look anything like I thought it was going to look, pretty much, my life. But I wanted the plan. And, I had a friend who just kept telling me, just let your life unfold. Just trust God. Listen to him, let your life unfold. So there were people who did a lot of different things to help me.
Yeah.
And some were mowing lawns, and some were, some were helping out with things. Other things, people were calling and checking in on me.
Yeah.
I cannot emphasize enough the importance of people sending a text or calling. You asked when the loneliest parts of, for every widow and widower, hands down, it's the evenings. It's dark, it's quiet, that's when you spent time with even sometimes to this day, evenings, I will say, especially during the pandemic, I just wish someone would call me. I just wish someone would text and say, hey, how's it going?
Yeah.
That's all you need.
Yeah. It's interesting that as you kind of lay out some of these things, there is a tremendous power in just presence.
Yes.
And sometimes, as you alluded to, we're not sure, how can I be helpful in this way, or how can I be helpful in this way? How can I be helpful in that way? And there are some practical things, and there are some emotional things, and always point back to the Lord. But there is just tremendous power in presence.
Yeah.
And part of, I think, the reason that there's power in that, I think there's power in that everywhere, which is why we're so passionate about discipleship in community. But especially for someone who has had the presence of another removed.
Right.
There is this huge gap of relationship, of I used to have someone who was always there. And one of the things you kind of shared with me is how, and maybe we can get into that a bit, how relationships changed. So previously, you would have had couples friends, right?
Right.
You generally don't, on some level, you have his friends, her friends, but for the most part, you have married couples and you go do things with that. How did those relationship dynamics change, and how might that be instructive or helpful for the church to understand?
Yeah, you're right, they changed. And for one thing, I lost most of the connections with people that your dad worked with. And this is part of the something that I would like to just really urge people.
Yeah, please.
Is that what I see, and this is from my own, not quite so much my own experience, but the people I have the vast majority of people I've worked with over the years.
Absolutely.
I've got a lot to work with here. This idea that, people really are swarm around people in the midst of a crisis. So, the funeral, there's lots of people there. There's lots of cards. People bring in, food. I never thought about one of my best friend, Sherry's sister-in-law brought food to the visitation for the family since we were there so long. I never thought of
Somebody
doing
brought
something.
toilet paper to the house because you're like, I know you're going to have a lot of people over.
Yeah,
Like, there's some practical.
So think about all the things that you have to do, and then think about, that grieving person needs to do them.
Yeah.
But what usually happens is that after about the first month or so, the 3 C's go away, which I call them the 3 C's.
Okay.
The cards, the casseroles, and the calls.
Yep.
Okay, people start backing off.
Yep.
And I don't think it's that they don't care, but that usually happens at the very time when the griever is starting to plunge into the worst of it. Yeah. The worst of it is not the funeral, because it's all adrenaline.
You just got to make decisions.
It is, and it's prescribed. You know what to do. You're doing all these things. The hardest part is when you have to go back to your regular life and you realize, I don't have a regular life anymore. Yeah. It's usually 6 weeks to 2 months out, and that's usually when people's contact stops. And I really treasured the people that were determined to say, no, I'm in for the long term. Yeah. I'm in for the long term. Yeah. And I just, this is something that the community, and I'll just mention this now because it comes in my head. Yeah. And that is, there's been a lot of research over the years in the thanatology field, which I'm a certified thanatologist, which is I have a certification in death. Yeah. Okay? That is real great. Conversation starter at a party. But the idea is there's a lot of research, and the research is consistent. The number one best predictor about how people are going to do in their grief is their level of support. And what an opportunity for the church, the community, the body of the church, to embrace people who are grieving and say, we are, it's hard to go to church alone. Yeah. It's horrible to go to church alone. And be careful about encouraging people to come back to church too early. And I'll tell you why. Because people who are grieving tend to have a lot of sensitivity to sound, to light. And when you think about church, that's all it is. It's confusion, a lot of people talking. Yeah. I remember the first time, and I may have told you or Anna, one of you, that I can go back to church as long as nobody looks at me, talks to me, hugs me. Right. I want to come to church, and I can't take that. Yeah. So I tell people, come late, leave early, sit in the back.
And be gracious and generous with. It doesn't mean that they're walking away from their faith or from their community. They're dealing with something. If you haven't experienced it before, you just have no concept of what is going to be challenging or difficult.
But the church and the community, those people, they need to be intentional. They need to see, when was their wedding anniversary? That's going to be a hard day.
Firsts. Yeah. We always talk about firsts.
It's going, and you know what? It's not just firsts. In fact, sometimes the seconds are harder than the firsts.
Interesting.
But be intentional. Yeah. I need to send a note. I need to put it on my calendar. I need to send a note. I need to visit. I need to call. We have so many ways to communicate now. Yeah. You can email, you can text, you can message, just so many ways.
Yeah, and the beauty of a lot, if you think about it, put it on your Google Calendar on your iPhone and have it remind you, and then just send a text message.
Right, exactly.
That's incredibly meaningful. And frankly, fairly easy. Right. Like that is super low hanging fruit. Yeah. So
and do that for like ever. Yeah. I mean, because the grief never really goes away. Yeah. I mean, you learn to deal with all of the other pieces, but you always still miss that person. Yeah. So memories, it's wonderful. Even now when somebody will tell me a memory of Dad, or this is something I really appreciate. Yeah. Or, something that was so precious was for years, the first text I would get on the 4th of July was from Anna's sister, Laura. Just, I'm thinking about you. I'm praying for you. I never met Mike, but he was a great guy. From what I hear, he was a great guy. Yeah. I mean, talk about
Yeah.
touching my heart.
Yeah.
Another very touching experience was when I was moving my office. It was a lot of work, physical work. It was a
Yeah.
lot of emotional work. I had been in that
Man,
office
yeah.
for
Heber
many,
Heights, right? I
for
remember
many,
that.
many years. And you and Anna and Michael
Yeah.
and Doug had come over to kind of look it over and help a little bit. And I will never forget Doug saying to me, "We are so proud of you." And you know, when you've lost your spouse who would always tell you how
Yeah.
proud they were,
Yep.
that was so meaningful to me.
Yeah.
That, you know, because we need, widows and widowers need cheerleaders.
Yeah.
Nobody
good.
tells us we're beautiful anymore. Nobody tells us we're handsome. We need people to do that, those kind of, bless in just those kind of ways.
That's really good. I think you brought up a good point that the grief never goes away. And a lot of our conversation today has been focused around the early phase
Right.
of transitioning into being a widow or a widower.
Right.
Let's close out with now that you're, 15, 16, 17 years
Yeah.
out of that initial crisis, what does it look like for the church to care well for you? And you've referenced some of those things already, but let's kind of conclude our conversation with what does it look like now for a widow to be cared for, maybe long after, and you're with new people who didn't know Dad, and so it may not even know the story. They just know you're unmarried, and so help us as a church understand what it looks like to care for somebody who may have been a widow for a long time.
Well, I will say that one of the most difficult time periods for me recently was the pandemic. Because I was quite, because of having your grandma,
Yep.
my mom, and I
Yep.
used to say my elderly mother. I don't say that anymore because I think people think
Because
are
when
like,
you started saying it, she was actually your age. Is that?
no, well, no. I was actually like, oh, come on, who are you kidding? You're elderly too. I thought, and I realized I'm not going to say elderly mother anymore,
Yeah.
but compromised,
Sure.
health compromised. So I did stay away from church for a while.
Yeah.
And I think that was a really difficult time for me because again, I didn't have anyone to lean into.
Yeah.
Most, if not all, all of my friends now are married.
Yeah.
I don't have any friends that are widows.
Yeah.
And so,
Even those who I know you had
Several
some
of
friends
them-
that were widows that have gotten remarried.
right, which brings up a good point that I wanted to bring up.
Yeah.
In every church that you've ministered in, I have asked you to find me a husband. And
So far, I have failed you.
you have failed me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just wanted to
Yeah.
bring that up.
I'm going to say it's because my standards are so high.
Okay.
That's, and not at all because I think you would eat them alive.
Well, yeah, okay. But anyway, I had been boy crazy in high school. I had been boy crazy in college. And that was one of my greatest fears, is that when Dad was gone, that I would want to look right away for somebody.
Yeah.
And so I prayed. I prayed hard on that. And I just prayed that God would need to be the matchmaker. And He has not brought someone in my life, and I am very content.
Yeah.
He has given me a great deal of contentment.
That was incredibly
But-
mature.
Yeah.
Well done.
And it's true. It's
It is.
honestly true.
It
There
is.
are a lot there are a lot worse things than being alone.
Yeah.
So, anyway, the pandemic was hard because of the leaning into, and so, but I have a wonderful church, an absolutely wonderful church,
Yeah.
and so I would say right now, the biggest needs that I have are just those practical needs.
Yeah.
I have good friends that remind me that I'm not alone.
Yeah.
I mean, we do a lot of things together, and I don't feel alone in that way.
Yeah.
But those practical needs.
That's why there's always a list when I show up, which is
Yeah,
great. I'm happy
yeah.
to serve that way. I'm
But
very
I
thankful
mean,
for it. But
they don't
Yeah.
ever end. And,
Yeah.
I don't ever see myself learning how to troubleshoot a lot of things. I can do a lot of things.
Yeah.
And that's primarily what I do in my job is troubleshoot, but
Yeah.
not, like
not furnaces and,
right.
and iPads and printers.
Exactly. And they
yeah.
they wear on me. And so the church has been just so wonderful in that way.
It's interesting to think that what would have previously just been a nuisance becomes an emotional burden
It does.
in being a widow or a widower. Let's conclude with, as you think about a church and as you think about how a church should care for widows in their body and widowers in their body, what would you say to the church on this?
Yeah, I would. One thing I would say is that it's hard to come to church alone when there's so many families.
Yeah.
Please invite people, women who come to church alone, to sit with you, sit with your family, get to know. I love it when couples ask me to go out to lunch with them or something. I like being with couples. I like being with men. I like to hear a viewpoint of a man. I like that part of it. If you know of widows who don't have family nearby, invite them over for 4th of July or for some kind of, include them.
Yeah.
Please, men of the church, please seek out those single women and say, how can I help?
Yeah.
I've got 2 hours on Saturday afternoon. What could I come over and do that might be helpful for you?
Yeah.
Ask about their husbands, their late husbands or wives. We are the keepers of their memory. And nobody wants to think that the memory of their loved one will just fade.
Yeah.
So, ask them, tell me about, what did your husband enjoy doing? What did you two do together?
Yeah.
Sometimes there's a fear that, my goodness, you'll start them crying. I tell people we cry all the time, so it doesn't,
Right. Right.
But it makes us happy.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think there are times when people are uncomfortable with that emotion, but the overflowing of grief and joy and all of that in the memory of a person, that's not as painful, but it is painful, but it's also joyful, and it's okay to to just allow that to happen. You don't have to be uncomfortable with that. It doesn't mean you've hurt us by asking the question.
Exactly, and even if a widow or widower has adult children, grown children, we don't want to be dependent on our kids.
Yeah.
We don't want to be emotionally dependent. So step in, physically dependent, even if you live around the corner, still offer to help, encourage, remind us of those scriptures that talk about God as in his stooping posture, in his standing posture, remind us of hope. Please continue to tell us that it's fine that we still grieve and cry after 16 years, 17 years. Don't shame me if I say, geez, I've got to leave now because, an anniversary party, because everybody here's married and it just reminds me of some hard things.
Yeah.
Just say, I'm going to pray for you and I love you.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. I love it. Any final thoughts? Anything that you wanted to bring up that we didn't get a chance to cover?
I don't think so.
All right. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for kind of digging up some of those old things and those old experiences to share from the well of experience and what God's done. I really appreciate it. Hope this has been fruitful for all of you, and grateful for your time today. Thanks, Mom.
Thank you.
Love you.
Love you too.